We're close to 1,000 subscribers, and stories like this are exactly why. Hit subscribe and let's begin. A peninsula wedged between 3 seas, 3 empires, and 3 alphabets has spent the last 2 centuries telling its people the same story. That their blood runs in an unbroken line back to the tribes who stood on this ground before Rome ever arrived. Serbs point to ancient roots. Croats point to ancient roots. Bulgarians, Greeks, Albanians, each nation's textbooks describe a bloodline that survived conquest, survived empire, survived everything, intact. In 2023, a genetics lab tested that claim directly. Not with folklore, with whole genomes pulled from centuries-old bone. The result did not confirm an unbroken bloodline. In some parts of this region, more than half of the ancestry carried by people alive today traces back to populations who were not here 1,500 years ago. Not distant cousins, not minor contributors. More than half. If more than half your ancestors showed up in the last 1,400 years, whose land was it to begin with? Here is the story most people already know, and it is not wrong. It is just incomplete. Long before Rome, this peninsula was home to Illyrian tribes along its western coast, Thracian tribes across its eastern interior, and Dacian populations pressing in from the north. These were the original inhabitants as far as written history goes. Rome arrived over roughly 2 centuries, from the late 2nd century BCE through the 1st century CE, and folded the entire region into imperial administration. Roads, garrisons, taxation, a new official language layered over dozens of local tongues. Then Rome's Western authority collapsed in the historical shorthand of the 5th century CE, and a second wave arrived. Slavic-speaking peoples began moving into the peninsula from the north and east, starting in the 6th century CE. Over generations, according to the story every schoolchild in the region learns, these Slavic newcomers became the linguistic and ethnic backbone of the nations that exist today. Serbs, Croats, Bulgarians, and the language families that still divide and unite the region depending on who's doing the dividing. Illyrian roots, Thracian roots, Dacian roots, Slavic roots. 4 claims to the same soil, and every modern nation in the region has built its identity on defending one of them, roots. That word carries enormous political weight here. Serbia's national historiography leans on continuity from early Slavic settlement. Bulgaria does the same, with its own inflection. Greece, further south, has spent nearly 2 centuries insisting on direct descent from classical antiquity, specifically to hold that Slavic migration at arm's length. Croatia threads a needle between Illyrian ancestry and Slavic identity. None of this is invented history. It's just history written to answer a question blood tests weren't yet able to ask. And there's a tidy geographic explanation offered for why this region ended up so layered in the first place. The Balkans sit on the Danube corridor, on the old Roman road network including the Via Militaris, at the literal crossroads between Europe and Asia Minor. Everyone passed through here. Of course, the population is mixed. That's the accepted explanation, and it's been good enough for over a century of scholarship. In 2023, researchers set out to test it with hard genetic data instead of historical inference. They picked one of the richest burial sites in the former Roman world to do it. The site is called Viminacium, a Roman military frontier settlement in what is now Serbia, holding the remains of an estimated 18,000 people. If the accepted story were correct, this is exactly where you'd expect to find it confirmed. A Roman garrison town, sitting on the empire's edge, should genetically resemble Rome. It didn't. Here is where it gets complicated. An international research team, led by Inigo Olalde, an Ikerbasque researcher at the University of the Basque Country, working alongside David Reich of Harvard University's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, with Carlos Laluesa Fox of the Institute of Evolutionary Biology in Barcelona, and Miodrag Mike Grubik of Western University in Canada, plus Dusan Kekarevic of the University of Belgrade, sequenced whole genome data from 146 ancient individuals. More than a third of that sample came directly from Viminacium. The results were published in the journal Cell. Think of a genome the way you'd think of a family recipe book passed down for generations. Every ingredient list tells you exactly which older recipes it was built from, and in what proportion. When researchers read ancient DNA, they're essentially checking whose recipe books contributed to whose. What they found at a Roman military stronghold was a recipe book heavy with ingredients from Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, during the height of Roman imperial control, and almost no trace of ingredients from Italy itself. A Roman frontier fortress, defended for centuries in Rome's name, carrying almost no detectable genetic signal from Roman Italy. Clean. Expected. Wrong. The soldiers manning this frontier, the people the traditional story assumes were Roman in the sense of coming from Rome, were overwhelmingly transplants from the empire's eastern provinces. Anatolians, integrated so deeply into local Balkan society that centuries later, their remains are indistinguishable from anyone else buried at the same site. The Roman era of Balkan history, at least at its genetic core, looks less like Italy and more like Asia Minor. There's a second anomaly buried in the same dataset. The team identified 3 individuals of African origin, living and eventually buried in the Balkans, under Roman rule, at this same frontier site. Direct genetic proof that a garrison town on the empire's edge was pulling in people from a genuinely global network, not the closed regional population the tidy consensus story implies. Researchers are careful to frame this as probability, not certainty. Ancient DNA works from a limited sample, and 146 genomes cannot speak for an entire imperial population across 4 centuries. But the pattern holds consistently enough across the Viminacium remains that the team treats it as a genuine demographic signal, not statistical noise. There's a smaller physical detail that adds texture here. Researchers examining the skeletal remains noted unusually well-preserved dental health among the Roman-era soldiers at the site, a detail suggesting a diet lower in refined sugar than later populations, and different again from other groups buried at Viminacium in later centuries. Small forensic evidence, but it's the kind of detail that turns a genetic data point into an actual human being who ate actual meals 2,000 years ago. The first theory researchers point to for explaining all of this is, on the surface, fairly straightforward. Rome was not a loose confederation of provinces left to their own devices. It was an administrative machine that moved people deliberately, soldiers, merchants, tax officials, engineers, wherever the empire's logistics required them. Anatolia, in the empire's eastern half, was densely populated and closely tied by trade and military supply lines to the Danube frontier. Stationing Anatolian origin soldiers and settlers on that frontier wasn't an accident of migration. It was policy. And this wasn't unique to the Balkan frontier. Olalde's team points out that the city of Rome itself, the actual imperial capital, shows the same ancestry shift toward the eastern Mediterranean during these same centuries. If the pattern shows up simultaneously at the empire's political heart and at one of its military edges, that's not a local fluke, that's an empire-wide demographic current, and Viminacium just happened to be where the evidence survived well enough to read. The date range researchers assign to this shift sits within the Roman imperial period, roughly the 1st through 4th centuries CE, the same 146 genomes, the same site, now read as evidence of policy rather than accident. It's a solid explanation. It accounts for how these Anatolian transplants got to a Roman military frontier in Serbia in the first place. What it doesn't explain is why almost none of that ancestry survives in strong concentration in the region today. An entire genetic layer, deliberately placed by imperial policy, defended for centuries at a fortified frontier. And yet it isn't the dominant signal in modern Balkan populations. Something happened to that Anatolian layer. Something big enough to bury it. And this wasn't even the largest demographic shock this region would absorb within the same 1,000-year window. Something bigger was coming. Something researchers describe as one of the most significant population changes anywhere in Europe during this era. And unlike the quiet, policy-driven arrival of Anatolian soldiers, this second wave would prove far more contested, far harder to pin down, and, in some corners of the region, still politically uncomfortable to discuss today. The second theory researchers point to has nothing to do with imperial policy at all, and everything to do with a migration nobody could fully control or administer. Beginning in the 6th century CE, Slavic-speaking peoples began moving into the Balkan Peninsula from the north and east, and according to David Reich, whose Harvard lab carried out the sequencing behind the same 2023 cell study, this migration represents one of the largest permanent demographic changes anywhere in Europe during this entire era. Not regional, not minor. One of the largest on the continent. The genetic footprint isn't uniform either. It moves in a gradient, like water finding its own level depending on how far south you measure. In present-day Serbia, incoming Slavic-associated ancestry sits at roughly 50 to 60% of the population's genetic makeup. Move south into mainland Greece and that number drops to somewhere between 30 and 40%. Push further, out into the Aegean Islands, and it falls again, down to around 20%. North to south, the signal fades, but it never disappears. Here's where the researchers stop agreeing with each other. Some geneticists and historians read those numbers as evidence of mass population replacement. Entire regions where existing communities were substantially displaced by incoming Slavic-speaking groups. Others argue for a subtler process, large-scale admixture layered onto existing populations over generations, without wholesale replacement. It sounds like an academic technicality. It is not. In Greece specifically, this exact question has fed directly into more than a century of political argument over ethnic continuity from antiquity. A debate that predates modern genetics entirely, and one that modern genetics has only made harder to settle, not easier. Hedge that carefully. Researchers studying this period are explicit that the genetic data can measure ancestry proportions with real precision, but it cannot by itself tell you whether that ancestry arrived through conquest, settlement, intermarriage, or some combination playing out differently from valley to valley. The data gives you the what. It does not hand you the how, but here's the detail that changes how you should have been reading everything up to this point. Remember the Anatolian layer from the Roman frontier, the transplanted soldiers, the Viminacium genomes, the entire Roman-era ancestry that took nearly 700 years of cell study forensics to even detect. That layer didn't survive intact into the modern population. It got substantially overwritten by this second wave. The Anatolian migrants Rome deliberately stationed on the Danube frontier weren't eventually replaced by some resurgence of the original Illyrian or Thracian population reclaiming their land. They were replaced by yet another set of outsiders arriving centuries later from a completely different direction. The Roman ancestry most documentaries about this region center on isn't the dominant signal in much of the modern population at all. It's a minority thread, buried under a bigger, later migration. One invasion's genetic evidence quietly erased by the next one's. The third theory is the one most researchers are far more hesitant to say out loud, and not because the evidence is weak, because it reaches back further than most people are prepared to think about when they picture ancient ancestry. Beneath the Slavic layer, beneath the Roman Anatolian layer, there is a third, older layer, steppe-related ancestry, tracing back to the Bronze Age, associated with the Yamnaya pastoralist populations of the Pontic-Caspian steppe. Think of this ancestry less like a single event and more like a slow-moving flood that arrived roughly 5,000 years ago and never fully receded. Iosif Lazaridis, at Harvard University's Department of Human Evolutionary Biology, led the 2022 science paper, often referred to as the Southern Arc study, tracking exactly how this steppe-descended ancestry moved into the Balkans, Anatolia, and Armenia beginning around 3000 BCE. In ancient Bulgarian remains specifically, this steppe-related genetic signature is close to undetectable during the earlier Copper Age, and then climbs to roughly 63% of total ancestry by the Middle to Late Bronze Age. Not a trickle, a takeover, playing out over centuries rather than years. There's a more speculative branch growing out of this same research, one that hasn't settled into consensus. Some of Lazaridis' recent work has floated the idea that the Albanian language may represent the earliest surviving linguistic trace of this original Yamnaya-descended population in Europe. Older, potentially, than Greek's own claim to continuity from the Bronze Age. Treat that carefully. It's a live hypothesis, actively argued over, not a settled finding. The kind of claim that could be reversed by the next genome sequenced out of the region. Steppe migration, Roman Anatolian resettlement, Slavic migration. 3 separate population events, each one, in its own century, believed by the people living through it to be simply how things had always been and always would be. Stand at Viminacium today, and none of this history is separated into tidy chapters. It's compressed into a few acres of riverbank soil. The Danube runs beside the site the same way it has for 2,000 years, indifferent to which empire currently claims its banks. Below the surface, in a single burial ground holding remains from an estimated 18,000 people, a Roman-era soldier of Anatolian descent can be resting within meters of a Slavic-era settler who arrived 4 centuries later. 2 strangers to this land, buried close enough to share the same layer of topsoil, neither one aware the other would ever exist. A lab technician, extracting genetic material from a single molar that has sat underground for roughly 1,700 years, does not see any of that context. She sees a sequence of base pairs, and when that sequence resolves into an ancestry profile, it sometimes points to a different continent entirely than the military uniform the skeleton was buried in. A Roman soldier's insignia wrapped around bones that trace back to Anatolia, not Italy. The dirt doesn't lie, but it also doesn't explain itself. That part takes a sequencer, a research grant, and 18 months of statistical modeling before a single sentence of history gets rewritten. This is the part the records don't explain, and it's the part that finally reframes everything that came before it. There is no single original population buried at the bottom of all this layering, waiting to be uncovered as the true, authentic Balkan people. Go back far enough and you find Neolithic farming communities whose ancestry, in places like early Bulgaria, runs 80 to 90% back to Anatolian farmers who arrived with agriculture itself. Layer on top of that the Bronze Age steppe migration, climbing to roughly 63% of the region's ancestry by the late Bronze Age. Layer on top of that the Roman-era Anatolian resettlement, documented directly in the Viminacium genomes. Layer on top of that the Slavic migration, still measurable today at 50 to 60% in the north, tapering to 20% in the southern islands. 4 major population shifts. 4 separate moments when this land's genetic makeup changed dramatically enough that, viewed from a distance of centuries, each one looks less like an addition to the people who were already there, and more like a replacement of them, which means the entire premise of indigenous ancestry in this region depends entirely on which century you choose to freeze the tape. Point to the Illyrians and Thracians as the true original population, and the data shows they themselves were largely descended from Anatolian farmers who arrived with agriculture millennia earlier. Not indigenous in any absolute sense either. Point to the early Slavic settlers as the authentic ethnic foundation, and the data shows they were displacing populations that had already been reshaped by Rome, by the steppe, by farming migrations before that. Every claim to being first turns out to rest on someone else's first, one layer further down. This isn't an abstract academic argument confined to journals. The same genetic questions sit directly underneath some of the region's most sensitive modern disputes. The ethnic and territorial fault lines that re-emerged after the breakup of Yugoslavia. The decades-long naming dispute between Greece and its northern neighbor over who gets to claim the word Macedonian and what ancestry that claim is supposed to rest on. Researchers publishing this data are generally careful to frame it in purely academic terms, but everyone in the region reading the headlines understands exactly what's at stake in a finding that says, nobody's bloodline here is as unbroken as the history books claimed. One of the archaeologists involved in analyzing remains from sites like Viminacium has described the experience of working through these burial layers less like reading a family tree and more like reading a story someone kept erasing and rewriting on the same page. The ink from one version still faintly visible underneath the next. That's not a metaphor for a textbook. That's a description of what 146 individual genomes, extracted one tooth at a time, actually look like when you lay them out side by side across 2,000 years. Enlarged, not solved. Every population on this planet carries some version of this same layered history. Migrations stacked on migrations. Each generation certain it was the final chapter. Most places, the evidence simply didn't survive well enough, or hasn't been tested closely enough, to prove it in this kind of detail. The Balkans are different only because a Roman military cemetery on the Danube happened to preserve 18,000 skeletons, and because a team of researchers across 4 countries happened to have the funding, the technology, and the patience to read what was buried in them. A river doesn't remember every flood that shaped its banks. It only shows you the shape the last flood left behind, sitting on top of every flood before it, indistinguishable now from the original bank unless someone digs down far enough to check. That's what this peninsula's DNA turned out to be. Not a bloodline running in a single unbroken current back to some ancient source, but a river shaped by flood after flood after flood, each one certain it was the water that mattered. Scientists finally tested the Balkan Peninsula's DNA, and the results didn't just add a footnote to its history. They rewrote it, and the ink underneath that rewrite is still, quite literally, sitting in the ground, waiting for someone to dig it up again.